Go for it.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Sally, and I'm an occupational therapist. And occupational therapy should have been called functional therapy because we talk about function. We talk about how we can help people get to a higher level of function, and that can be in their occupations as students, adults, kids, all ages, it doesn't matter. And one of the things that I'm lucky enough to have a whole bunch of experience working with is treating neurodivergence, but not just with kids, with adults, with, pretty much all ages. One of the great things about, doing this kind of work is I've moved from adult mental health, teen mental health in hospitals into pediatrics, and I've taught, I've done a lot of different things, and so I want to share. And what I would prefer is if you can put your questions, if you have them, into the chat. Let Luann hang on to them if you wouldn't mind, because I want to be sure to get through the material. There's a fair amount here, but what I'd really like, it would make me so happy, is if you could just sit back and listen and relax, because this is your evening. And I want to just, give you some information and make it palatable, useful, and take what you like, leave what you don't. And there's always time for questions either after this. You can email me. I don't care. I just want to make sure that this comes easily to you and that it's information you can use, and not only the information, but ideas for what you might try when you leave here. So thank you for being here. That's the most important part. And a little bit of humor doesn't hurt either, because I'm pretty sure all of our faces show the kinds of work that we're doing with our kiddos and adults. Jumping right in. This is a definition that is fairly commonly used, more or less, of what neurodivergence is. So we're all on the same page. And I see a very broad definition here. Basically, it just means that there are all kinds of conditions that may vary from whatever it is that we consider typical. And I'm going to say right now, I think differences are the norm. I don't see there's a, right and wrong, or even a typical and not typical, as much as I see just a range of variations in the human brain. Okay. Just like, some of us have big noses and small feet, we have different parts of our brain that work in different ways. And so what we want to do is just understand these variations. And some of them are pretty, you would think are significant. They seem like they might affect an individual in very important ways, and others not so much. And some of them are noticeable, some of them are not, but they may still affect somebody. So we're just looking at the acceptance of all of these variations and realizing that there seem to be just lots and lots of variations in our very complicated brains. And my job as a therapist, and my hope for everybody, is to move all of us toward the best level of function we can be, the best health we can be in our brains, right? And our bodies. A lot of times people will ask, and again, this is not hugely important so much as just people are curious about, is this genetic or is it experience? And of course, the answer is both. They interplay with each other, especially with our foster kiddos, because they have, a lot of them may be coming with a genetic package. We all have a genetic package, but they may be coming with a couple of things that might be something that their biological parents have experienced. But then also there's some things that happen with experience, which might be a health condition. It might be the post-traumatic stress that some kiddos experience when they're moving, and other things, the adverse childhood experiences that you probably know. But the most important thing I think to remember is, yeah, there's a genetic component. You've probably seen that with people, that you can see somebody. My son-in-law, for example, has ADHD as a diagnosis. And his mom says, oh my goodness, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. I'm sort of the same way. They're highly functional, but that's a diagnosis that, we can see has some genetic components. So, but again, it has to do with the interplay, and the best thing we can do is help people get to be as functional as they can, regardless of whatever package they present us. One of the things that I think is sometimes a little bit startling for those of us who've done foster and adopt. I have two adopted kids who were adopted at older ages, FYI, that parents who have serious mental illness were generally more likely to have CPS contact and more likely to have kiddos removed from their homes. This is a statistic. I can't remember. I think it's 2019. I will go back to that for a second. Just so that you know, mental health issues can be a primary risk factor when we're talking about the parents. The other thing is that a lot of kiddos in foster care statistically have some more higher level of mental health issues than is perceived than the general population. So it's something to think about. So whether that happens in your household or not, it is not uncommon. And again, it's not a death sentence. It's a sentence to see, oh, what can we do to make this better? Okay. The one thing we definitely have to talk about is any kind of prenatal exposure. And I owe it to the FASD people to say, yeah, a lot happens before your kiddo was born. That if someone is using alcohol or drugs or has a terrible diet, poor diet, I don't mean just eating junk food, but I mean just has some differences in diet and high stress levels, they're going to be affected. And this is a big duh. You all know this, but there are some very specific things that are associated with the prenatal exposure that have to do with physical health, that have to do, the low birth weight, the premature birth, those kind of things, and have to do with some cognitive developments in terms of how their brain wires a little differently. Depends though. So much depends again on that interplay of genetics. It depends on when the fetus was exposed to different things, all of that, just and how, vulnerable, so many things influence it. But I, have to say that these are things that are often seen when there's been prenatal drug or alcohol exposure, poor diet, et cetera. And, it's just really smart to be aware of what you may be dealing with, right? Bottom line on those things is that in those atmospheres of chaos and stress, the regions of the brain that affect fear become wired more strongly. In other words, children will predict that they're going to have neglect and are going to tend to regress under stress. Not 100%, please, but this is the kind of thing you tend to see when there's been kind of a fear, a lack of safety, continually feeling safe. And this can be anything from, whether there's been abuse, neglect, chaos. Lots of chaos can be really hard on a brain that's trying to develop. Okay. And oftentimes a rule of thumb we see is that there's a delayed emotional development of about 2 years, more or less. I certainly know that was true with my kiddos who were adopted at 5 and 12. And there was definitely younger presentation, which can be really hard, by the way, if you've experienced this with your kiddos and other people saying, well, he's 5, he should be doing XYZ, when the kiddo is not there emotionally or physically or in other ways. When we adopted a 5-year-old, she was 27 pounds and could rubber joints. She couldn't go up and down stairs. She was, really had a lot of problems with motor control and was absolutely starving. So, there's going to be some problems there if we expected her to be a typical 5-year-old. So you can understand that can add stress even just because of how the kid presents. Anybody familiar with that? I hope. The other thing is prematurity and early illness. Anybody, even without the prenatal exposure to drugs or alcohol, any kiddo who is premature can sometimes have more differences in terms of just things not having been formed completely. And sometimes it takes a while to catch up. And that can sometimes lead to more hospital experiences or more, kind of scary experiences of having to get medical care more frequently than maybe well, none of it's optimal, but any kind of medical care. And it can sometimes make a child a little bit, traumatized because of not being well and having these early illnesses. again, fortunately, I always want to be positive, and I always want to say that as long as people are kind of dealing with these things and know that it's going on, there's always ways of managing or moving forward in the best possible ways. So it's not a negative, it's just something to be aware of, because that's another thing that causes different brains that are, kind of responding in what might be considered atypical. So far, so good. Okay. One of the things, this comment, I couldn't not put it on here, that as an example, a child with ADHD has had so many more negative comments than others. And, it's kind of what I was alluding to about when somebody says, well, act your age. Well, what the heck is your age? Or, when you have differences in learning and attention and processing, you're more likely to hear some negatives, and that can be internalized, because that the external voices with kids sometimes get internalized, and sometimes I can give you an example of that. My older daughter, when she actually was adopted and then returned to a care facility after she'd been there with a family for numerous years. This is in another country, and just believed that she was a bad kid. She totally believed she was a bad kid. And when she got back to an orphanage, she was suicidal, because she just felt like, what can I do? I'm a bad kid. I have no, resources. I have no way out. Fortunately, she was in a position where she met some other children who were about her age, and she got into, a pattern of certain behaviors that were definitely not suicidal, thank heaven. But that's the kind of thing that can happen, right? And especially when you've been told things over and over again. So it's really important to recognize that these negative comments are not doing anybody any good, right? I'm going to shift into sensory processing. And the reason I'm shifting into that as a specific is because all of the other diagnoses we've talked about, whether they are mental health diagnoses, behavioral diagnoses, brain difference diagnoses, all have some component of sensory processing in them. They all have something, each of them overlap with how we take in information from our senses. And I think it's super smart that we understand that, because, we talk about, the digestive system and the musculoskeletal system and all of the circulatory system, all of those, but we don't often talk about the sensory system in a thorough and understanding way. And it's kind of fundamental. I wish, more people knew about it, which is why I do this. So what that basically is how you receive information through your senses, how your brain puts it together, and how you respond in, we hope, is a functional manner. Okay, it's the intake, the interpretation, and then putting it all together. Because remember, we have a bunch of senses, right? And if you have differences, or even if even if you're off a little bit with your sensory processing, it can change how much energy you have, how you react to situations, your function, pretty much everything. And this is not just for kids. This is for us. This is for sensory health for ourselves. How many of you, feel great when you walk into a kitchen and they're cooking cinnamon rolls? That can be part of your sensory health, right? How you take in this information and how you interpret it has a lot to do with how you feel. Okay, and how you respond to things. So that's just one way of starting in looking at the most common way that we have neurodivergence, because if you think about it, we have these five senses. In kindergarten, you learn that you have touch and sight and hearing, and wherever you learn it, you have these basic five senses. But that's not the whole picture, because there are mystery senses, I call them, because they're so badly understood, of proprioception, vestibular, and interoception. And I will be taking these apart much more, but just so that you understand, proprioception is where your body is in space, basically, awareness of where that is. And it's kind of your grounding sense in a way. There's another piece of it called motor planning, which basically is the part where you are deciding where to put your body in a coordinated way. Think about when you get into your car. And where do you put your hands? Where do you put your legs? Where do you put your seat? Okay, that's part of what motor planning is. And I'll talk more about that in a bit, as I will with the others. Vestibular everybody knows vestibular. That's the dizziness sense. That's the little fluid in the little bones in your ear that tells you about movement and balance. And it's actually its purpose, the way I read it, was to keep your eyesight steady over your body so that you can move fluidly. Okay. And if you've ever been on a boat, for example, and you get off the boat and you feel like you're still on the boat, that's your vestibular system, or a plane, or sometimes cars. People who get car sick are sensitive to the vestibular system. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's interoception, which even therapists didn't talk about very much for a while, but that is a really kind of cool one because it's the perception of inside your body. For example, when I'm thirsty, I know that I probably need to, have a little bit of something to drink, or the perception of, when I need to move a little bit, I got to move because my muscles are feeling stiff. So that's inside the body perception. So these three senses are neglected. I feel terrible for them because they're super fundamental. And I have some good examples that you can think about your own kiddos or yourself as we go through. But here's the overview about sensory processing, because there are a lot of people who will minimize or magnify or minimize information that comes in from their senses. Okay. And that's not something we do by choice. That's something in our neurology that just has been tweaked a certain amount. Still can be very highly functional. Sometimes it causes dysregulation. It causes people to be kind of thrown off, and it'll affect your function. And if it does, there are things you can do. But she gives a good overview, which I will just play for you because I like her accent too.
Signs and symptoms of sensory differences vary depending on which sensory system is affected. This is why sensory processing disorder can look very different from one child or adult to the next. Each individual's brain interprets and connects sensory messages differently. This is why different individuals might have a different reaction to the same sensory information. What might seem like a regular sound to one individual might sound like a very loud sound to another. These differences can occur with each sensory system. When there is more sensitivity, it can lead to sensory overload. We must always remember that behavior is only the end product. It is a clue to us that the child or adult might be finding the sensory information difficult. It's our job to be detectives. If we can increase our knowledge about the senses and potential responses an individual might experience, then we can start to interpret behavior differently. We can explore strategies and solutions that can help to support individuals to engage and participate despite any differences they may experience. If you want to learn more,
I like her positivity also. There's always a way. It doesn't mean that there's going to be magic, but there's always something, it seems, that you can do to help someone move forward. And that's kind of the strength-based part of it. I really like when we take it on as something we can do. Okay. So I'm going to start in on proprioception. This is the one with the information on your muscles and joints. And again, one of the things I was talking about is motor planning or praxis. They won't talk about this in here, but I will. Imagine I have a ball here and I'm going to throw it to you. Okay. When I throw that ball, you have something going on in your brain based on past experience, right? We hope, of the ideation, the idea, the sequencing, and I'm throwing this to you, and you're sequencing what body movement you need to do and the timing to put up your hand and catch the ball, right? So that ideation, the sequencing, and the completion of a task has all to do with your proprioception. And guess what? You don't even think about it very much, right? Because it's subconscious in a sense. It comes from experience. And, if you're learning baseball or something, you're going to be paying more attention to it. But think about how many times we do that with where our body is in space. And if someone has issues, has differences in that, it's going to be harder for them, right? So that's where we come in and try to take a look at this. And here's a great little quick video, another great accent. See what you think.
This is the sensory mini-series. Today we are talking about proprioception. This is the sensation we get through our muscles and tendons. These are the proprioceptors in the muscles and in the tendons. They respond to push, pull, heavy muscle work, and stretch. The information gets to the brain like this. At the brainstem and thalamus level, proprioception can influence the processing of other sensory information, helping us to stay regulated and pay attention. At the level of the parietal lobe, we get a conscious moving picture of our body inside our muscles. This helps us know where our body is. It also helps us to plan how we can use our body to interact with the world around us with smooth and graded movements. Without good feedback from the system, we can have difficulty staying calm and focused. We pull out a drawer too hard, not grip something hard enough, or struggle to have our bodies in the right place at the right time. We work this system by increasing feedback through the receptors. So push, pull, lift, carry, climb, jump, and stretch. Let's move more.
And I would say her "let's move more" comment is probably true for so many of the things that, we come along and say, because one of the things to learn about where your body is in space is to move and to kind of get that feeling, whether someone tends to need more movement or less movement, or hitting that just right level. That's what we're kind of all about when we talk about these systems. And proprioception works very closely, again, with the vestibular system, which is the inner ear system that processes movement experiences. So you can see the lady on the swing here, or I don't know how old that person is, but the person on the swing, they're not only getting the movement, presumably, of the swing, but they're also getting kind of that pressure of the body against the swing for most of her trunk. So you have both proprioception and vestibular, and these can be really good for working those two systems.
This is the sensory mini-series.
Today, we are talking about the vestibular system. It tells us how we are moving through sensors inside our ears.
There are two types of receptors. One is our semicircular canals that tell us about rotational head movement.
This helps us keep our balance, stabilize our eyes, and not feel anxious or overwhelmed when we are moving.
If this system is not working properly, we struggle with our balance, have difficulty with smooth eye movements, and struggle to use the two sides of our body together.
The second type of receptor is called the otoliths. They tell us about gravity so that we know which way is up and we feel secure on the earth.
They also tell us when we're speeding up and slowing down.
When the system is not working, we may feel fearful of movement or struggle to stay upright.
We can help this system by encouraging but not forcing special types of movement.
Slide.
Jump.
Stop and start.
Wobble.
Swing. Let's move
more. For more information.
So you notice they said, "let's move more" again, which is telling us something, isn't it? Anyway, you can understand then how this is basically important for movement. And the reason that I think it's super important is because when kids want to run and play, when they want to, sit in a classroom, whatever they're doing, they're moving their bodies in ways, and they need the information at the just right level for various circumstances that they find themselves in. And the other piece of that is she did mention here, by exposing kids or having kids move, but never forcing, because that's another thing when people are sensitive to certain kinds of movements. If, for example, I find in my older years that I do not like being dizzy as much as I used to roll down a hill and do everything that, you think kids do. And yet at this point, having me do that would be very, very uncomfortable because my sensory system has either changed or I have kind of become sensitized to some vestibular movement. So never force it. You never force it. You can suggest, you can encourage, but it's anything that's forced is usually going to backfire or not be effective. Now, that third sense I talked about, the third mystery sense, is interoception. And I think it's absolutely fascinating how these are symptoms like when you start to feel a fever, or like I said, when you're dehydrated. Some people can really feel their heartbeat a lot. And it's interesting that sometimes people, when they are feeling anxious, will be more attuned to their heartbeat. That's how interoception is related, again, to some of the emotions that you have, because your body and your emotions, of course, are, very completely linked. So sometimes the interoceptive sense, if it's tuned down, you may become depressed, or you may not notice certain aches, or you may feel them more. It's so interesting how interoception and how you get the messages inside are it's going to affect your function. And, people who have a high pain tolerance may be kind of tuned down in terms of their sensations of pain, which is is an inside sense. All kinds of different ways that your brain works with these, and also how it has to do with emotion, and it can change depending on the state you're in. Here's a book that you can, easily look up called Interoception, How I Feel. It's by an occupational therapist whose name is Kara Kuczynski, and it's a good one. It has also sort of an adult section in the back. It can be handy if you notice something in your child or yourself that seems to be different in how you interpret inner sensations. And then if you're watching, this is a beautiful video, beautiful visually, and also gives some wonderful information about the interoception system, and gives some examples as well. So I'm going to play it here. Enjoy it. If you can watch, it's wonderful.
Interoception is our capacity to witness and feel the environment inside ourselves, from muscular tension to the beat of our heart, from the rhythm of the breath to the relative fullness of our stomach, from the soft calm of relaxation and laughter to the tense rigidity of fear and anxiety. Since inner sensations can often not be separated from emotion, interoception is a key concept in holistic mind-body practices and is an important indicator of self-awareness and well-being. Interoception is often considered alongside proprioception, which is the sense of one's body position in space. It is the awareness of your body in relation to the things around you. Interoception builds on proprioception by focusing on the internal experience. Proprioception is the awareness that might help you to avoid bumping into things, while interoception is the experience of pain in your body when you stub your toe. Interoception is also key to helping the individual regulate bodily needs, such as hunger, cold, and exhaustion. In other words, it is the experience of the embodied self. The range of interoception varies widely among human beings, as the experiences of one's life will shape the tone and texture of one's inner world. Trauma, disease, diet, socioeconomic factors, and dynamics of oppression can all intersect to inform and impact the character of interoception for an individual. For example, on the one hand, one can suffer from PTSD and experience reduced access to interoceptive awareness, often described as feeling nothing. On the other hand, one may suffer from acute anxiety disorder and experience a hypersensitivity to interoception, and in turn have more inner feelings than one can handle. These examples imply that interoception is a continuum, and extremes in either direction can throw us from our center. Contemplative practice and somatic forms of therapy in part aim to expand the orbit and balance the field of interoception as an aid to liberating individuals from unnecessary suffering. By developing a new relationship with our inner world, we can begin to taste the fruits of a more fully embodied life.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. I am fine if there are any questions at this point, because it's been so quiet out there that if anybody has any questions, I'll take it. If not, I'll just keep moving along. But any questions? Pop it up. Let me know. Luann, you hear any questions or anything in there yet?
No.
Okay, I think it's pretty straightforward information. If you can, you may be familiar with the senses or not, but I think it's well worth thinking about them, not just how they are defined, but how does this affect your own child? I can tell you, interoception for sure. How many kiddos I worked with. I had a pediatric clinic in Gig Harbor, Washington, where I still consult, and how many kiddos we would have coming in who didn't pay attention or were not tuned in interoceptively to when they needed to go to the bathroom, or if they had cuts on their legs or arms and they were bleeding and they didn't notice, things like that. Those were things we were trying to get kiddos to tune in more into their bodily sensations so that they could respond appropriately. I mean, there are people that when they're tuned down to those kind of things, they may not, they may not respond if they have a fever. They may not necessarily know when they're sick, or other kinds of things when they don't have that modulated by their, internal sensations. So worth knowing about.
Sally,
Okay.
there was
Yes.
a question, and I think you may have
Okay.
just answered it, but it's with the interoceptive sense, what does it look like to not be regulated?
Okay, that's one. The bathroom one is for sure. People not noticing when they're sick is another one. Let's see, what else can I say? Sometimes when people are over tuned in, like I was saying, when somebody's anxious and they feel their heart beating very quickly, or if you've been around people who are just, kind of really focused on their digestive system and really notice everything in their stomach, and their stomach is very sensitive because they're really tuned in to the sense of when food is moving through their stomachs or the digestive pieces. What else have I run into? I hope that answers the question, but I'm thinking most commonly a lot of it is the need to go to the bathroom, or kids, people who really don't know when they're hungry. They, sometimes, we know that sometimes we get busy and we don't eat or something. That's never been my problem. But to have people who, just don't have that sensation. They have it perhaps, but they don't tune into it because their brain is kind of tuned down in that area. So they don't have that. Oh, another one that I'm thinking of too is a sense of fullness when you eat. I have run into numerous situations, and these may be complicated by other things, such as somebody not knowing when they're full. I've had numerous. Now that is with foster kids, and that's sometimes because guess what? They didn't have enough to eat in previous life. So they feel, not just the hoarding, but that they want it. They don't have a regulation mechanism of when they are full. Okay, so those are a couple of examples that I've run into and particularly with some foster kiddos, and oftentimes different parts of their lives too. So that they may be, in puberty or changing when they may be more tuned into that, but then there's a sort of an extra added piece where they just, don't know when to stop. So hopefully that answers what's being asked. And if you have more questions at the end, we'll talk. Okay. I added a bonus. The auditory sense is something everybody kind of knows about, okay? But this is just such a good video. I want you to hear about it. Plus, there's one more thing. I have run into, as a therapist, so many people, adults and kids, who have what we kind of call slow processing. Now, that does not mean there's anything wrong with somebody's intelligence, nothing wrong with their hearing mechanism. It's just that when information comes in through their auditory system, that part in the brain that is managing it tends to be a little bit slower. Okay, they call them kind of the 10-second person in a 5-second world. Nothing wrong with intelligence. It reminds me of when I was a kid and I would tell my mom a joke, and then I'd hear her off in another part of the house laughing. Some of that was her interpretation. Maybe she just didn't get it. But I'm talking about kids that just take that much longer to interpret. And that can be so tough because if they get a 2 or 3 step direction from you or someone, they're back on the first direction processing by the time you've kind of expected them to do the third part. Or when something comes to them at school and they don't have it in writing or written on the board or anything, and it's just been oral, then they don't have the ability to, kind of get back there because they're going just a little bit slower, just a beat slower. Doesn't have to be a lot, but probably you can think of people like that, whether it be your child or not. There are different kinds of auditory processing disorders, and this gal is talking about hers. It is very much an individual thing, but she's so interesting in the way that she describes it that, again, I think it's worth knowing about because people do come with these kind of neurodivergence experiences. And she's cool. I like her.
I have APD, an auditory processing disorder. When I was a kid, I had frequent ear infections, which led to minor hearing loss, but I can hear fine now. Now it's thought that my frequent ear infections and hearing loss hindered my ability to learn to process spoken word accurately. So physically, I can hear you, I just can't understand what you're saying. Experiences vary from person to person, but I've tried my best to mimic what APD is like for me. So let's say I'm at a crowded Christmas party. The whole extended family is there, and enough people are jammed into the house that I can't even make it outside to find my siblings and watch them lose at foosball. I retreat to a corner in hopes of spotting my mom, as I only feel the beat of the holiday music. Suddenly, I'm accosted by a second cousin that I only remember because she offered me a beer at last year's Christmas party, which I adamantly declined. So let's say she asked me, "So do you have any plans for New Year's Eve?" But with the holiday jingles that just seem to be getting louder and louder, the clatter of plastic utensils devouring the seven fishes, and the sporadic and distant cheer of my siblings and cousins that I so desperately want to locate, the words jumbled together, so I hear something more like this. "Alors, any plans for the Vive?" So here's the fun part. Trying to decipher this encoded message in a time that is socially acceptable to stop and think about an answer. Let's say around 10 seconds. First is context clues. Is she offering me a beer again? I didn't hear anything that resembled beer or drink, but that's always an option. It's in a dark room, so I can't really rely on reading her lips like I usually do. Secondly, I have to think, what did I hear? Well, I didn't hear any real words per se, but I did hear something that sounds suspiciously like Stephanie, and another thing that sounded just like Steve. Now, these happen to be the names of my mom and my brother. Could be a coincidence, but I'm running out of time, so I bite the bullet. Yeah, I was just looking for them, actually. And you'll always add the laugh at the end for good measure. She stares at me. I stare back. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, I think I messed up. I cringe as I hear that one. The same year I got diagnosed with APD, I attended a Sweet 16 party. A girl I knew from grade school came up to me on the dance floor and started talking a mile a minute. So I smiled and nodded. That night when I went home, I told my mom that she wasn't speaking English. It was something else entirely. I'm traditionally dyslexic as well, but that's a topic for a whole other video. And the point I'm trying to make is that the best analogy I've ever heard for APD is that it's like dyslexia for your ears. My eyes can see just fine with contacts in, the same way my ears can hear just fine. My brain just can't take in the information and put it out as something that makes sense. I have to do the work for it. We with APD have to work twice as hard just to get through the day. It can be exhausting, definitely. There's no cure, but there can be coping methods if you catch it early enough. So here's the deal. Be patient with us. Sometimes we may not be able to understand what you're saying, but we'll sit in the corner at a party with you and we'll listen and we'll decipher and we'll say the wrong things all night, gladly, if you just give us a chance.
Isn't she delightful? I think she really sizes it up too, because I like the way that she says how much harder she has to work with her brain, for her brain to be functional. And it takes more time and it's just exhausting. I mean, imagine how that is. And that's because she has a neurodivergent brain, but again, she's accepted it and she's found ways of dealing with it. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but it certainly is, helps her be more functional. And I like what she did with this. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. most of you kind of know what it is when you run into people who are sensory seeking. It's people who, a lot of times teachers or other people will maybe label a kiddo as having ADHD or things like that. I'm not necessarily saying I can't diagnose. That's not in my scope of practice. But what I can say is I can say you can see when someone is looking to take in more sensory information than they have. I know people, who like to jump out of airplanes and do zip lines. And I have a son who's a runner who does ultra marathons, and that means 100 miles. So he likes that pounding and the vestibular movement and all of that have to do with, kind of his sensory input. It's people who always want more. And sometimes that can be a problem with impulsivity. Sometimes, learning when to get that sensory input is pretty difficult in a learning process. But you know what sensory seeking is. Then we run into people who may be sensory sensitive. And you always hear about, the tags in the shirts and the seams in the socks. It can also be, though, really hard for people in those situations in crowds or smells, people who will walk into a newly cleaned up, disinfected washroom and find that the smell of the cleaner is nauseating and they can't be there. When casual touch is frightening or so arousing that a person can't really even brush up against you. You can think about when you think of somebody who is sensitive, how you can tell loud noises, all those kind of things. So I don't have to dwell on these kind of things. You know what we're talking about? Oh, here's some fun. If you can see, those of you who are not having your cameras on, it's a picture of pickles, and someone is saying the smell is stabbing my face before I can even get it into my mouth. Great description. Or the one that's with mushrooms, it says, feels like a party of slugs in my mouth. Ugh, like human earlobes that squeak when you bite them. You can get an idea. I'm not going to read the one about grapes covering an eyeball, but these are the kind of things that very graphically describe somebody who has sensitivity to certain types of food, as you can see. Everybody's different on this stuff. And that's, again, if it's functional, fine. You don't have to go through life eating mushrooms. You can usually avoid pickles, and you can probably not have to eat grapes either. But when it becomes a problem, when it becomes something where it's getting in the way of function, that's, kind of where you want to find what you can do about it. The last kind we know about sensory seekers and sensory avoiders. And again, that can be any or all of the senses, right? The ones that I kind of have the most concern about are people who have what we call low registration, which means this is like if someone doesn't know when they are feeling sick, okay? They have low registration in their interoceptive system, okay? Because they don't feel those feelings of fever or sickness or sore throat or whatever it is. It can sometimes overlap with the kind of inattentive type of ADHD where people just seem like they're bored or they're out of it. Sometimes it can look like depression or overlap with depression, where you're just not tripping their switch when it comes to getting a response, okay? And that could be in hearing and vision. Just people kind of needing more to get their attention. Okay. And I worry about those kind because a lot of times they're the kiddos that don't cause a lot of trouble. They're kind of off in the corner of the classroom, and, they're just off in their own little world. And it's hard for them because it's harder to relate. It's harder to get a response when somebody has low registration, just doesn't register on sensory information. So you get a whole bunch of different kinds. And then, of course, we get the mixed responses. No wonder people with sensory differences have been called out of sync, because it can be sometimes, you can be a seeker, but sensitive in other ways. So you might be somebody who's seeking all that, movement, and yet you may be very sensitive to taste or very sensitive to touch. You can have all of these different, because the brain is so wonderful and it's so different in all ways that, we can have all of these kind of different presentations. One thing I noticed about auditory, which I think is really interesting, and it would be worth knowing about this with other senses, is one time I was in my pediatric clinic and I was working with a kiddo and we were kind of humming or singing along to a song, and another kiddo who was there said, "Oh, Miss Sally, please don't. feels really loud to me, and it's really hard for me to have you do that. And I'm like, okay, sure, fine. And then a little bit later, I see the same kid and he's singing and pretty loud. So I was like, oh, okay, you may have some control over that. Maybe it's because you're doing it and you know when it's coming out, as opposed to me and my friend. So sometimes I think there's maybe when you have more control, you can manage it better. I don't know. It's always worth thinking about, but everybody's different on these things. Again, if I were to go to the eye doctor, you're going to the eye doctor, we would both walk out almost for sure with different types of glasses because our visual acuity is different. So all of us are different in our sensory systems too, sometimes to a large degree, sometimes to a smaller degree. And so our brain's going, what's happening? What's happening? Here it is. So what do we do about this stuff? Okay. Oh, one of the things I wanted to throw out, especially because this is pertaining to foster kiddos, is all of these responses that we have to trauma or to things that make us upset, whether it's collapse or fight or freeze or all those things kids do in foster care. Statistically, again, they experience trauma at high rates. You're not surprised about this, right? So it's important to know how this may look, and it may shape their worldview, their behavior, all of this. And the sensory system is a great way to provide some safety and comfort if you know what works with them to help them feel safe in their bodies and in their senses. So it's not just to know this, but it's to know that there are things you can do with sensory input that can help with a feeling of safety. Pretty cool. One of the things, there are some studies about, again, that are neurodivergence issues more common in foster kiddos. And for the answers have been done in studies. This guy's from Cornell who says that critical period soon after birth is important to kind of map sensations when a child is first coming through, and it leads to the development of normal behaviors when you have normal, I like to use the word typical better, but that help kind of regulate that sensory system early on. And by that, I mean the pressure of holding, the feeling of sucking, which is, another sensory input, the swinging and rocking, which helps with the vestibular system. All of those things are important to help those sensations get sort of mapped, as they say, in the brain. Here's another way of saying it. And if those neural circuits don't form correctly or don't have help along the way, deficits can lead to not only sensory deficits, but social relationships. And that's another reason why it's so important to understand these things, is because interpersonal relationships are what we're all about. This is what we all want. So having those circuits that work with your sensory system are important to relationship as well. So anyway, I think you got the pitch about sensory, okay? One more thing to just mention, because this is a really interesting study, is that the maltreatment for kids in early years has been associated not only with people who react differently in their senses, but actual visual, physical pictures of the brain are different because of certain kinds of abuse that kiddos have. And the scientist, Martin Teichert, says that it's because, he postulates, because as the child is forming their sensations or their sensory processing, they are wiring and trying to kind of detune these experiences, which is really cool. In other words, the brain is trying to protect them, is what he said. And you can read the article, his study, it's really interesting. One of the things they found, and think about this if you have any kids that have any auditory processing, that verbal abuse in childhood is associated with pictures. These are actual brain pictures of abnormalities in the child language processing centers. Which is really interesting. So then when the child comes to you, they've got these things going on, the abuse isn't happening, but they've had some differences in their auditory processing. Same thing with the witnessing of domestic violence. There are visual, observable changes in the brain of gray matter in the visual fibers that have to affect the memory and the emotional response to pictures. So I can't say why the brain does this, but they're, they're only guessing. They're just telling you that these pictures have been taken. For sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, there's some more alterations in that visual cortex, especially around facial recognition. And then in emotional abuse, where some kid has had different things said to them that are emotionally abusive, there are different things to see in these places, the cingulate cortex and all these bilateral precuneus isn't so important as the fact that it's just having to do with a kiddo's self-awareness and self-perception. So the brain does protective things when there has been abuse that are actually observable to scientists who take pictures of the brain. And then they come to you, and there you are, working with these kiddos that have these differences, and God bless you for doing it. Bottom line, the early trauma disrupts that developmental flow. When you think about the effect on neurodivergence, they have this inner working model that the world is unsafe, it's unpredictable. And it makes the brain, again, rewired to see things that are dangerous when they're not, which is why some kids, there are studies where some kids will be looking at your face and you have a pretty neutral expression on, you might be just reading your email or something, and they may feel like you might be mad. Even if you're not really mad, but your face might look a little bit serious or whatever, and they may interpret it because of previous experience. It's kind of things that you maybe can tell me about that you deal with your kiddos. So what can we do? That's the important part. What can we do? And the bottom line is, mentioned it earlier, functional, great relationships, having the best possible relationships you can with those kiddos. And then, spoiler alert, one of the things I learned early in the attachment classes that I got my certification in, high structure, high nurture. Kids are happiest in general. You can't always overstructure, you can't always over nurture. You want to have that balance between structure and support. And that's spoiler alert. That's kind of ways that I will emphasize as we go through this, along with the neurodivergence piece. But those are the kind of things that seem to work best in the families that I see that do well. Okay. And again, don't get discouraged, because trauma may change the brain, but healing changes it too. And we can all be part of that healing. And it's pretty cool to be part of that healing. And there you are doing that. Okay. I love the 8 magic keys. This is also to mix it with compassion and lightheartedness. This is kind of part of the structure piece. And as they say in the middle, it's the master key for trusting relationships. One of the things I know when working with kids, maybe of all ages, is to talk in concrete terms, to be as specific as you can. Sarcasm doesn't tend to work metaphorically, or similes or things like that, maybe, but not always. You tend to want to use the most concrete for saying what you mean and meaning what you say. Routine, predictability, structure, supervision. One of the things that I know is sometimes very difficult, but again, it's part of that emotional system being younger, to get closer with your kid at times that you may or may not think you want to, or you may or may not think they need it. Be closer than you think sometimes, because it tends to be beneficial. Okay, consistency. Nobody gets it consistent all the time. Nobody gets it right all the time. But as much as you can, try to be as predictable and use a lot of the same strategies, whatever it is, not to not be creative, but to just be the person that your kiddo is learning and knowing about. Okay. You can see there's all of these are great. Okay. The other thing is that these sensory motor interventions that I'm talking about, these where they said in the definitions of, or descriptions of vestibular and of proprioception, to use sensory tools helps regulate the nervous system for anyone, whether they are whatever we call neurotypical or not, to just ground a person in their own body, to help them feel really good, to to have some foundational skills so they have trust in their body and they can know what it feels like to move and to take in information in the most functional way they can. It gives you some power, it gives you stability, and it helps grow the neural pathways, because as you know, every experience that you have is developing a neural pathway, and the more you do it, the more consistent it becomes. Okay, so these are why I love sensory motor interventions, because sometimes you don't need to just talk about the problems. You can actually make somebody feel better if they have something that they are chewing gum, or they have a ball to feel that has little spikes on it, or various different things that are actually calming and organizing for your brain, with the variations understood, knowing the variations of your child and knowing what they like to help them feel calm and organized with the sensory system, okay? The other thing is just kind of the mental reframe. And I had to do this so many times of how can I get my child to do this or not this, but how can I help them develop the comfort level and the skill to be able to do or not do this? So you're not trying to force or, push a kid into something as much as you're trying to help them want to do it or help them to feel comfortable doing it, because you'd best believe they're going to do it more than if, we are orchestrating everything. Of course, there are times when we have to do that too, but how can I help them develop a skill and a comfort level? Okay. This is Bruce Perry. Bruce Perry is a trauma expert a lot of you may know about because he wrote a book with Oprah called What Happened to You, about her trauma and other things. But he is a fabulous trauma expert, and he is around YouTube all over the place, lots of classes and lessons and wonderful stuff. And basically what he says is you need a sequence of regulate, relate, then reason. And what are they talking about with regulate? I think the first part for this is we personally need to get our own act together and have our emotions in a place that is appropriate to the situation. In other words, to be calm, basically, when we're trying to work with someone else. And so you can regulate, then connect with a person, and then do the correcting, the reasoning, whatever it is you want to do. It is the most efficient, really, way of working with kids, is to have ourselves together, take a couple of deep breaths, think about what you want to say and think clearly, then connect, then reason. And according to Bruce Perry, who is an excellent trauma expert, that's the best sequence of engagement. And I think it makes all kinds of sense. Okay. The other thing, as I was trying to say before too, is develop your own regulation first, to know some of your threat predictions too. I know parents, and I know myself, that there are certain things that hook you. There are certain things that are going to make you frustrated or angry. When kids curse, perhaps, or when somebody is disrespectful, or when somebody lies. Those kind of things may be the thing that is really something that gets you. And to have that, to know that, to have that sort of self-awareness can be really helpful, because then oh, here that comes. I know that's something that from whatever reason really bugs me. So I'm going to practice the pause. I'm going to hit that pause button, and I'm going to take about 3 deep breaths, and I'm going to think about that so that I can take it easy, reconnect, take a time out, do whatever it is you need to do, because you don't want to get into a situation where you do damage, or that you just mess up a situation. I mean, you're going to have plenty of mess ups without, it just happens in parenting. But if you can practice that pause, most things don't have to be solved in the first 2 minutes, okay? Unless a kid's standing in the street and somebody's, you need to push them out of the way because a car's coming. Most of the time, you don't have to react as quickly. And again, Luann mentioned something earlier when we were talking about we're modeling for our kiddos, right? And this is such a time when everything happens so immediately because of the internet. You get these immediate responses and immediate solving of problems, and games are so fast and everything. How about just taking a minute, and say, hey, let me think about that. I want to think about what I have to say, or, I'm going to walk away for a minute, and then I'm going to come back, and I'm going to have a different idea. The pause is really important, and I hope we can teach our kids this, because the rest of the world is not doing a lot of pausing these days. Okay. I hope you're happy to see Animal here. I'm very proud of the fact that I have a GIF on here. Okay. That's my big, answer to technology here. Again, this is Bruce Perry, who has done so many articles and so many things. And he says when people are anxious, high anxiety or medium anxiety is patterned rhythmic somatosensory activity. So that is another reason I think music is super important. Any kind of movement that's somewhat rhythmic is really good for lowering anxiety. And again, that has to do, I have a picture of somebody swinging, that's a vestibular activity. Playing drums is both proprioceptive and vestibular and auditory and, tactile, whatever. It's so many different senses. But one of the things that sometimes I know when our household used to get a little bit chaotic or people were starting to elevate in mood, sometimes I would just, I could do one of two things. I could either turn up the music and say, hey, let's just dance. Let's just move for a minute. Let's get the energy out here. Or I could turn the music down and just say, okay, we're going to do some breathing here. Drumming is really interesting too. You don't have to have a drum. Just tapping on a desk or a surface, a table, and asking your kiddo to tap back the pattern that you do. Say, hey, listen, I want you to listen to this pattern. And I know sometimes when kids are distressed, they may not do it with you, but try it sometime and have them tap out something and you tap back. It's a great thing to practice not only auditory processing, but this kind of rhythmic activity that can be really good for regulating the brain, because it's just, kind of a biological thing that it's why there's been dancing and drumming and all those things in civilization since the dawn of time, right? Is because that kind of activity can be calming to your brain. Okay, another thing is, and this is another sort of attitude thing, but I like to say, use the movie camera technique. Don't conclude, don't judge when you get into something that you're not quite sure what to do with. Pretend you're just watching with the movie camera. You're not making any decisions. You're not jumping to any conclusions. So instead of looking at this kiddo's picture and saying, he's angry, he's sullen, he's whatever, maybe think about, his arms are crossed, he's quiet. I mean, my goodness, this kiddo could be thinking about whether he's going to go outside or eat a snack in this kind of a picture. You don't always know. Or the other thing that I've done with my kiddos is just said, hey, you've been a little bit quiet, and your arms are crossed. Is something going on? What's happening? If you see steam coming out of his ears, it's a little bit easier to say, I feel some energy from you. What's going on? Whatever it is. You all have techniques that you use with your kids, but one of the things that I think is important is sometimes try to stay away from the negative predictions, because you may be right. I mean, he may be angry and sullen, but there's also a possibility that if you just ask or feedback, just be curious, because sometimes you may find a different answer than you think. Okay, here's another approach I really, really like, and this is from danhughes.org, who is an attachment-focused guy, and he's been around a long time and has also some videos that you can look up on YouTube. And it's basically approaching people. I intend to do this with everybody now. I started doing it as a therapist, and now I think I do it with everyone, where I like to be lighthearted in as much as possible. That doesn't mean I'm telling jokes all the time, but it means that I just kind of like when someone comes to consult with me, for example, I try to smile. I try to just, kind of make some little comment in passing about the weather, about something, just lightweight, and for kids, playfulness is their language. So if you can keep things as playful as possible, as much as possible, because it's the way they can relate. Okay. Secondly, is to accept when you're talking with your kiddos, remember all of the things that we've been talking about in the last hour of the fact that neurodiversity is the rule. Neurodivergence is something that is way more common than people want to think. So accept that they're coming in with a different background and different ways of being, and there's always a reason for the behavior. There is always, always, always a reason. You may not agree with the reason, you may not understand the reason completely, but there's always something going on with a person when they're having something that may feel negative to you. And it's just kind of helpful if you know what that is, and try to work towards that rather than, hitting on the blame right away. The third thing is curiosity. Again, it's like the movie camera technique. What's going on here? kids love it too. When you ask about their interests, learn about their personality, even if they're kind of closed up, there are different ways of going at that, by asking them to help you, by asking them to give you an evaluation. One of the things I really like doing with kids sometimes when they are, maybe not wanting to work or not as forthcoming, is sometimes quizzes. You can find all kinds of quizzes on the internet, and just quizzes about what they're interested, or true or false, or things like that, and just give them something to look at and say, I need you to look at this for me and give me some advice, or whatever it is. Those kind of things can give me a lot more kind of a sideways way of getting into helping me understand what's going on, and to show a curiosity about how they think and feel. And then, of course, finally, my hope is that through all of the time we've been talking here, that empathy is part of all of this, because again, all of our brains are different. We need understanding. We need understanding from each other, that there's a lot of anxiety going around. There's a lot of stress in our world right now. And, kids feel it. They feel it as much as we as adults feel it, and maybe more. One quick thing I'll tell you, and I know we're getting into a little bit more time than I said, but when an occupational therapist is looking at sensory kinds of things, I'll give you an example of what kinds of things that we might do, okay, with sensory differences very specifically. Is one time when I was working at my clinic, the copy machine was broken. It was making this horrible, squeaky, loud noise. Okay. And in comes a little girl named Corinne with her mom, who was adopted. No, actually, she was still being fostered. She became adopted, who had many special needs, among them auditory sensitivity, but she had numerous special needs and a fabulous mom. And so in comes Corinne looking and listening to this horrible noise from the copy machine. Okay, now her mom had some choices to help her. Corinne was about 5, maybe 4. And the first thing she could have done was just step out of the office and step out of the waiting room and just avoid the experience until it stopped and then go back in. That's an avoidance. Sometimes we can avoid certain sensory things. You don't go to Costco at the most crowded time if you don't like loud noise, okay? Or crowds, right? So sometimes you can avoid certain things. Sometimes you can adapt either environmentally or personally. Now, that would be an example if Corinne's mom had gone in and said, hey, Miss Eve, would you please turn off the loud copy machine until Corinne's back in the other room? And Miss Eve would have said, certainly. Or Corinne's mom, knowing that Corinne has some challenges with loud noises, could have had in her bag some noise canceling headphones or other sensory things that she knew that Corinne might like, something to do with her hands, maybe gum to chew, whatever it is that she might like. Okay, so that she could either adapt the environment or the person, right? The third thing she did, which was fabulous because Corinne had just been coming to the clinic maybe a month, is coping skills that she used right there in the moment. And the best thing that she did was she said, Corinne, I want you to learn how to manage these kind of things. So how about you sit down, you look at me. So she had visual, held onto her wrists and kind of squeezed them. So she gave her a little bit of the proprioception input. And she said, okay, let's breathe together. And they breathed in and out. So she had rhythmic breathing. So she was teaching Corinne some great coping skills in that moment, that if repeated or she came up with another situation, hopefully over and over, those things start to become part of who Corinne is and how she can choose those things. Ultimately, in the clinic, what we work on is desensitizing. We try to build distress tolerance for people who are sensitive. That doesn't mean we change them into people who love loud noises, but there are things that you can do to kind of build distress tolerance and, again, find other ways of coping. So I hope that explains a little bit of what therapists do, among other things, when they're working with sensory processing and other kind of neurodivergence, okay? People talk about a sensory diet. I want to throw that in. Sensory snack, sensory diet. Basically, that's something that is customized one-on-one with a child or adult to give them, to work with somebody to give them certain sensory input at, like you eat a meal, bites throughout the day, sometimes maybe something before school. You have somebody jumping on a trampoline if they're sensory seekers before they go into school, or compression garments, because we know that tightness in some of those garments gives that proprioceptive input or the tactile input that is desirable, or blowing bubbles before you do something, or outside. Hammock swings can be very popular for both the proprioception and vestibular sense. You get the idea. People who like the putty and slime and sand, kinetic sand can be a gift. Having that stuff around for when kiddos come home from school. Or carrot sticks and hummus was another favorite that one of my parents liked to use. Cooking, baking, massage, all of these things are ideas and parts of what could be part of a sensory diet. I threw in a bunch more here: the tactile, the music, a fish tank, pets. Oh my gosh, pets, what would I do without my dog? Vibrating toothbrushes were something that could work for a lot of different reasons. For kids who were very sensitive inside the mouth to kind of desensitize, or needed more. Vibration's really interesting sometimes, at how that works with various people, and how that kind of affects the nervous system. So here's a couple of really quick treatment ideas too. And I know Luann's recording this, so hopefully you can get a chance to look at these things again, but just little things where you tune into things to help decrease anxiety. You hold a strawberry and think about your association with it, the texture, the taste, looking at colors, different colors in the room. If you start feeling like there's kind of chaotic energy, you can say, hey, everybody stop. Tell me 3 things that are green. Anything like that can break the chaos a little bit. Or of course, music, having auditory array, having a stone in the pocket, all of these things are just little things that can maybe change how your kiddo's experiencing the world in a more calm and safe way. Okay. My favorites, 3 favorites. I used to tell the kiddos it was 3 magic: proprioception, or deep pressure; tactile input, all the fidgets and all the different, sands and putties and so on; and oral motor input. I have gum right here, chewing gum. I chew gum. I chew carrot sticks every day. Any kind of sucking, blowing. Also crossing midline. And I want to talk about that real quick, because this is super important for adults as well as kids. She's talking to adults here.
Hi, Louise Swartz-Walter here at Albuquerque Natural Health Center with another brain tip today for you. Many of you out there, I'm sure, are exercisers. In other words, you're going to the gym, you're taking walks, you're exercising, doing biking, something that you're doing where you're moving your body and you're getting the exercise you need to stay in shape. Well, did you know that exercise also helps your brain? Anytime you're crossing midline, even just this exercise, just crossing midline, okay? Even this exercise, this is part of Mind Gems. Crossing midline,
Like that.
biking, walking, you're crossing your midline. You're helping balance the right and left side of your brain. Actually, even playing music and reading music helps balance the right and left side of the brain. And when you can use your whole brain, both right and left, you can do more, accomplish more, you'll be more balanced, you'll feel more focused. So think about that next time you're having a day where you're just unfocused and you can't get it together, and you're thinking a cup of coffee is going to take you to that place. Do some exercise, get up, cross midline, dance, go for a bike ride, help balance your brain that way. Thank you for being here, everyone.
And I had a friend tell me it worked for her instead of a cup of coffee. So it's my story and I'm sticking to it. The other thing I found out just really quickly, talk to your kids and ask them to do something like cross midline. When I was working in my clinic, I always worked with foster kids and adopted kids. And one of the things I would do routinely was say, can you touch this elbow with the opposite knee? I usually did it when I was standing. And I was often surprised. The kids, and I would demo, and the kids would look at me and go, yeah, like this, and stay in the same plane. It has to do with using both sides of your brain. And some kids just are not in the habit of that happening. And it's a great way to do it, because you just have to cross both sides of your body. Like she said, it's really interesting. I challenge you to, try that with one of your kids when you get done, or tomorrow or sometime. Okay. So I have one more little video, and then I'm going to be finished and really happy for questions. This lady goes on, and I'm only going to start her with a couple of minutes. But what she says is why we talk about neurodivergence, and why we talk about the different things and ways we can help our kiddos cope.
Yeah. So it's just about connecting so that he's having a whole experience of himself. He's not getting cut off from parts of himself that he thinks are scary. If I show him, if I guide him to experience that the tightness can go away and be replaced with ooey gooey, let's go find bugs, right? Then all of a sudden he goes, oh, well, that's not so scary. It goes away. It's temporary. I can be in this place, but it's not going to last forever. It's not going to take me over. It's going to balance itself out. I'm going to come back to, feeling good, and let's get on with it, right? Instead of this, when they feel it and they don't like it, and we don't teach them about it, and they disconnect from it, and then they never want to go back there again. So that the second our children, if they're afraid of it, then they want to numb it, right? If they're afraid of what's going on from the neck down, because the last time they felt it, it didn't feel good, and nobody helped them to feel the polar opposite of it coming down, then they stay afraid and they want to numb. And so look at how early they're numbing. The first taste of marijuana, the first sip of a drink, the first, somebody teaches them how to cut. Well, wow, all that stuff is nectar from the gods, because it takes them out of that place that they're so scared of. We have to show them how to resource themselves back into that optimum zone in, doing it in a healthy way, as opposed to then finding these really maladaptive coping mechanisms, right, that put a Band-Aid on it. So they get that false feeling of, oh, I feel better, right? That's what the cutting, it just kind of numbs them and takes them out of it. That's what the marijuana, the alcohol does. So we got to be really careful that we're teaching them from a really early age how to connect to all of who they are, which includes sensations, it includes their body, teaching them ways to manage the arousal, resource the sensory awareness, right? So how do we use more specifically, right? Teaching them that, okay, when you feel that when you feel those cues inside your body, that's the time to go take a walk around the block. That's the time to look at the, orient around you, see the bird that's flying.
She says it better than I do. And I really hope that you can understand why this is important, especially when we're talking about neurodivergence. And the most common form of neurodivergence is sensory neurodivergence. So if people have other questions or other ideas about what we should be talking about, I'm about to be done here. Okay. Thank you for being here, because the most important thing, I think, is for all of us, as well as our kids, to feel safe and seen, to feel soothed and secure. And I hope that this gives you at least a few ideas to get started. And again, my information, here's a few of the links, and then my information is right here. I love doing trainings. I love consulting, and I'm more than happy to answer questions right now. I don't look like that so much anymore, somewhat, but we'll go back to another slide so I don't have to look at me. Any questions? Thank you for your time.